Our world is constantly changing. This has left many artifacts and mysteries to make themselves known. These timestamps are stored away in the frozen lands of our world and have helped us to better understand ancient life. So today, here at Unexplained Mysteries, we'll be going over 3 incredible things found frozen in ice. "106-year-old fruitcake." Conservators searching for artifacts in Antarctica were astonished when they unearthed a 106-year-old fruitcake. The fruitcake was discovered in the midst of a 2-year conservation project led by the Antarctic Heritage Trust. While searching Antarctica's oldest building, a hut built by Norwegian explorer Karsten Borchgrevink in 1899. The spectacular thing was, despite being so old, the conservators reported that the fruitcake looked and smelled edible. When investigated further, aside from a very slight rancid butter smell, the fruitcake was in excellent condition. It's already known that fruitcakes can last for a long time. Fidelia Ford made a holiday fruitcake in 1878, and it still exists. However, Ford's fruitcake is no longer edible, whereas the conservators pointed out the fruitcake found in Antarctica was. The program manager, Lizzie Meeks, accredits the ice-cold climate of the Antarctic for preserving the fruitcake so well. The condition of the fruitcake is even more impressive comparing it to the state of the tin it was housed in. The Huntley and Palmer's tin showed serious signs of deterioration, which meant that the conservators have had to put a considerable amount of work removing the rust using chemical stabilization. The question was, who had the fruitcake belonged to? The fruitcake had been created by Huntley and Palmer's, a British biscuit company favoured by Robert Falcon Scott. Documentation showed that in 1910, Scott had purchased a Huntley and Palmer's fruitcake at Cape Adare before venturing on his expedition to Terra Nova. Scott and his men were embarking on a demanding 6-week route which would see them spend an entire winter with few provisions and little shelter. Scott regularly chose to bring fruitcake on these missions, as not only was it a very popular item in English society at the time, it also was an ideal high-energy food for the conditions in the Antarctic, given its levels of sugar and fat. Unfortunately, Scott and his comrades' expedition was doomed. While Scott had dreamed of being the first person to reach the South Pole, he was beaten to the post by Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen. Returning to base in 1912, Scott and his men faced severe weather, frostbite, starvation, and exposure, and unfortunately all died. It's likely that Scott left the fruitcake at the hut, possibly planning on retrieving it on the way back. Unfortunately, the fruitcake outlasted Scott, and continues to do so. Never before has Russell Baker's comment that a fruitcake is forever been so relevant. "1,200-year-old Viking sword discovered on Norwegian mountain." 3 Norwegian men out hunting reindeer got a lot more than they bargained for when they happened upon an ancient and well-preserved Viking sword. Einar Ambach describes how himself and 2 companions were hunting in the mountains of Oppland County when they decided to stop for a rest. While sitting down, something caught their eye. It was a sword blade that was wedged between 2 rocks on the well-travelled mountain path. Given the lack of scratches or bending, experts say it's likely the sword had been lying in that exact same place for over 1,000 years. The men shared an image of the sword on social media that almost immediately gained academic interest. Experts were able to determine that the sword dated back to 850 to 950 AD, in the midst of the great period of Viking expansion. They said it was highly likely that the sword had been owned by a Viking swordsman. Though the blade of the sword had rusted and was missing its handle, it was still in remarkably good condition due to the extreme cold weather in the mountainous area. At slightly more than 30 inches long and double-edged with wrought iron, the sword could still do damage today if you sharpened the edges. Experts were fascinated by its presence, as it's incredibly rare to find remnants from the Viking Age in such good condition. However, any hopes of uncovering further Viking goods were shattered when an excavation on the site found no more artifacts. This suggests that the area had never been heavily populated by Vikings, which begs the question, why was this one Viking sword found here? In the 8th century, many Vikings left their native homes in Denmark, Norway and Sweden and began to spread out across Europe and beyond. The Vikings were famous for their attacks and pillaging of coastal cities and towns, and it was even Viking law that all men were required to carry weapons and be ready to wage war at all times. However, it was unheard of for Vikings to travel alone. Instead, they favoured travelling in fleets for group protection. The discovery of one lone sword in the Upland County region has led many to theorise that its sword bearer might have got lost from his comrades in the midst of a blizzard. The mountain path on which the sword was discovered is covered with rocks called scree that makes it incredibly difficult to walk on, almost impossible in the middle of a blizzard. The lone Viking might have perished in that very location, his body carried away by wild animals, and only his sword left to mark he had ever been there. What we do know about this man is he was fairly powerful and wealthy. A Viking was often defined by his sword, and swords were more likely to be used to convey social status than to fight one another. The sword in this case was made of iron. Extracting this type of metal would have been a laborious and expensive process. Therefore, we can deduce that the Viking man came from or built up to an affluent background. Tall el Hammam. Tall el Hammam today is an archaeological site in Jordan, but once upon a time it was a major city of 36 hectares with a population of 26,000 or more. During the Bronze Age, the kingdom dominated the entirety of the southern Jordan Valley and boasted an impressive fortification system stretching around its perimeter that included walls, monumental gates, and towers. There is evidence that during this time, the city thrived off its agriculture, profiting from its eastern territory into the hills and its access to the Dead Sea in the south. Tall el Hammam was clearly an affluent and successful city. What does not make sense is why it became completely vacant for 700 years in the late Bronze Age. The only explanation is that Tall el Hammam suffered a civilization-ending calamity. There were no traces of any wars or earthquakes on historical records, which has led some to believe that Tall el Hammam was a victim of a meteor that exploded in the air and wiped out the whole city. Certainly, the ruined state that the city was left in is consistent with known meteor airburst sites. Archaeologists who favour this theory have focused their research on the remaining architecture, pottery, and soil in the city. Firstly, the destruction and damage on the walls of the city can be directly attributed to a shockwave. Radiocarbon dating of the walls show that it all suddenly disappeared around 3,700 years ago and left only stone foundations. No earthquake would have the power to cause that level of demolition. It could only be attributed to a meteor airburst. Secondly, a pottery shard was discovered on the site on which one side had melted to glass. Examining this glass further revealed it contained zircon crystals inside a bubble that could only have been formed by temperatures of over 4,000 Celsius. As the glass was only present on one side, this suggests that it was created by one burst of intense heat rather than heat over a long period of time. Intense heat for such a short duration could only be present in a meteor airburst. Thirdly, samples of the soil in Tall el Hammam show large quantities of salt, which make it extremely infertile. These soil properties are accordant with the type of massive shockwave and heatwave involved in a meteor airburst. Some proponents of the theory that Tall el Hammam was a victim of a meteor airburst have gone a step further. They have proposed that Tall el Hammam was actually the biblical city of Sodom. The story of Sodom from Genesis tells of how the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah and overthrew those cities and the entire plain, including all those living in the cities, and also the vegetation in the land. Stephen Collins has focused his research on showing how the profile of Sodom in the Bible is a perfect fit for Tall el Hammam. Firstly, he argues that Sodom is continuously described in the Bible as the largest and most prominent city in the area. Tall el Hammam was easily the largest site in Jordan. Additionally, Collins states that the landscape of Tall el Hammam is already regularly referenced in other biblical stories throughout Joseph's era and served as the final camping sites of Moses and the Israelites before they crossed into Canaan. Secondly, according to Collins, the pottery, architecture, and destruction layers found in Tall el Hammam fit the time frame for the biblical tale of Sodom. If Collins' theory was accepted, the burning sulfur supposedly sent by God that destroyed civilizations and vegetations could very well be the meteor airburst. It's perfectly plausible that biblical writers, unequipped with modern research and unable to explain the disaster that struck Sodom, assumed it must have been a damnation from God. But what do you make of these interesting artifacts that have been discovered? Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments section below and help us by growing this community while working to solve these unexplained mysteries. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos.